This is Trend Following Radio, where great thinking comes alive. Nobel Prize winners, legendary traders, best-selling authors, and the pros that know what drive us irrational human beings. I am your host, MICHAEL COVEL. Not filtered, raw, honest. That's my passion. My guest today is Roger Housden, author, speaker, writing guide. Books for living and writing wild, as he describes it. The author of 22 books, Roger's work has been featured everywhere from the New York Times to the LA Times. His newest work is Dropping the Struggle. And I must say, it's one of those great reminders for me about the moment of right now. If there's any great lesson that I've picked up in the last 15 years, it is that, the moment of right now. That's all we've got. We don't have anything else. Look, I'm not perfect about the moment of right now. I can always get better about appreciating and staying only in the moment of all we have, which is now. Because there is no past and there is no future. We're not guaranteed of the future. The past is gone. So I appreciate greatly Roger's perspective in calming me down, bringing me back to the only thing that's true right now. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Roger Housden. So Roger, the newest work is called Dropping the Struggle. Typically with my conversations, I will leave for the very end where an author can tell a little bit more about their book, where to buy it, etc. But for your title, it's such an engaging title for so many people in so many different walks of life. To hear a title called Dropping the Struggle, it just, I want the Pandora's box to open and for you to give me the backstory. Of course, I know some about your history, so there's a deep backstory, but perhaps we could start with breaking apart that title and how it came to be.
Why Dropping the Struggle? Well, first of all, struggle has its place, doesn't it? I mean, you struggle, I'm sure, or have done, and I have, and we all have, because, well, it's really part of life. I mean, after all, we come out of the womb, some of us struggling to find air. It's not that struggle is always bad or wrong, but the kind of what I'm speaking to in dropping the struggle is in those areas of life, actually, in my estimation, the most important areas of life, where struggle simply does not work. That's really what I look at and explore in this book, different areas of life, really the givens of life, the existential givens of life that we all have, whether we all face in one degree or another, whether we like it or not. For example, the struggle for meaning or purpose, the struggle for love, the struggle against change, change is just the way it is. It's a given of life. We cause ourselves a lot of suffering often by resisting the inevitability of change. These kinds of areas, these givens of life, are where I find the struggle certainly has not worked for me. There must be another way in relation to those kind of themes in life that lead us on certainly an easier route, but not only easier, but a more satisfying route than struggle.
To dig a little bit more on the title, was there a lot of thought into the title, or was it a moment of serendipity? It popped in? How did that particular title come to you?
Nearly all of my titles in my books, and this is the same, really come out of nowhere. Now, when I say out of nowhere, nothing comes really out of nothing. But, if I wake up in the middle of the night, or if I early in the morning sometimes, and just there is a title. Now, of course, it's come from, the whole constellation of my unconscious, if you like. So it's emerged in that way from somewhere, but it's not emerged from something I've known, something I have rationally thought about. very often titles for me will come while I'm out walking in the woods. I mean, really out of nowhere. Walking is a very useful creative activity, by the way, both for new ideas, fresh ideas, and certainly for me, for titles of books. It's as if walking sets the blood in motion, sets the mind in motion, sets the heart in motion. We forget ourselves for a while. When we forget ourselves, the fresh and the new can enter in.
I love this one line from your work. Our greatest art, the most enduring ideas of philosophy, the spark for every technological breakthrough, originated in moments of reflective contemplation. As a guy who has written 4 books on a subject very different than yours, but still, I find myself that it's when I finally let go and I'm no longer working towards a deadline, I'm no longer working for some other reason, I don't know, in advance or whatever, but then when I just finally let go, and that's kind of what's happened to me recently, I find myself, and you have this great phrase, reflective contemplation, then the breakthrough happens.
I mean, I think pretty much every great discovery, scientific or artistic, has come in that way, I mean, almost by mistake. But of course, it doesn't, as I said before, it doesn't actually come out of nowhere. There's been an intense labor even beforehand, but the way the result actually comes can appear like serendipity, like Newton watching the pendulum of a clock, not Newton, Galileo, watching the pendulum of a clock and suddenly getting the whole idea of a basic law of the universe. That's that kind of opening of the mind, opening of our mind to a space. And I think, giving ourselves a space in that way, a space that is from our habitual thinking and our habitual doing. John Keats spoke a lot about this. The romantic poet of the 19th century spoke a lot about easeful non-doing, allowing ourselves to be in what he called negative capability. Negative capability. I love that term. By negative, he doesn't mean bad. He means an empty space. The capability that comes when we give ourselves an empty space. So people have known this forever.
That's a great point. The forever part, we could talk about that forever. Let me set the stage and take you in a little bit deeper into your work. There's another line, another quotation that I like in your work from the second book of Tao: to act without needing a reason, to sit still without knowing how, to ride the current of what is. This is the primal virtue. I think what you're really getting at is the moment of right now, and the moment of right now is our fate. But I would love for you to take a little bit of time, as long as you'd like, to try and open up for an audience, some that may have some understanding of your work, perhaps others don't. But the moment of right now is our fate. Try and give people a window from your perspective, all these many years of study, to better explaining that moment of right now, because it's very difficult for so many people, and for sure myself as well, for so many of us to accept the right now moment as the best moment. It is the moment. It's all we've got is right now.
Well, you've said it, Michael. That's it. Really, but it is. So we can unpack what you've just said, really. I say in the book, I mentioned Nietzsche in the book, Friedrich Nietzsche, who has this wonderful phrase in Latin called amor fati, to love, the love of one's fate. But Nietzsche didn't mean fate in the sense of, my whole life is laid out in stone and I'm just basically going through the motions because it's already been designed and laid out. That's not what he meant by fate, nor is it what the ancient Greeks meant by fate, actually. For Nietzsche, fate, the love of one's fate, really means the love of precisely what you were just saying, the love of what your life is presenting you with in this moment, because it is your fate to be faced with this life you have now. It's my fate right now to be sitting here speaking with you. That's it. That's where we are. This is what my life, for whatever reason, has led me to. This is what I have, what he's encouraging us to do is to say yes to it. Say yes to it because it's what we have. Now, the next moment, it can change. We all know that. So it's not resigning oneself to the way things are in the sense of, oh, well, I'll just accept it. No, not that. The love of one's fate. There's an energy in the word love. So not just accepting, putting up with, resigning oneself to the way life is showing up for oneself at the moment, but being willing to embrace it, to grasp it as your life, your unique life, my unique life, and actually the only life I have. This really is the only life I have. This is it. Getting that and understanding that to be my fate. And because it's my fate, however I respond in this moment is going to affect the next moment, the next fate, if you like. I'm actually writing my own storybook right now by the degree or by the way in which I'm either showing up for this moment or not. I'm writing my own story.
How many times over your career have you seen, and I'm sure the number is high, but individuals that will be perhaps stuck in a future linear path that they think they must go down versus, as you're describing right now, taking a step, seeing where you are, perhaps taking another step based on what happens next. I've already mentioned the word once, serendipity, to allow serendipity to happen. This is a very difficult concept for people in the modern age, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I think it probably always has been, but especially perhaps in the last century or so when time has speeded up immensely. For millennia, for centuries, human beings lived in agricultural time, which is, the gradual and slow procession of the seasons. Then with the industrial age, that started to shift altogether. In fact, it was only with the industrial age that the clock actually came in to determine and organize existence. It actually came in to begin with in England, which is the origin of many great trials and woes in the world. But it came in with the railways in England, the clock, because you had to have trains running at a certain time so that people would know when to wait on the platform for them. More and more we developed this notion of the past and the future, the future, where we're going, why we're getting on that train and when we expect to get at our destinations. Yes, we all have this propensity, I certainly as much as anyone, to think in and think about or plan for the future, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's perfectly natural, and actually it's really useful. I mean, if I didn't know that, if I hadn't planned in advance that I was going to be speaking to you at 5 o'clock, we'd be in trouble. It really does have its place, this projection into the future. The difficulty is when it takes over our whole, it preoccupies us completely, so much so that we're either living in what we're going to be doing tomorrow or next week, or we're living in yesterday and in the past. Although those are useful references, it's all happening now. And really, again, this again has been said for millennia. This moment is the one that we have. It's too easy to say that and make it just like a clever statement or a cliche, another thought in the mind. The one thing that is always present where we are is our body. For me anyway, for sure, the one way really of helping me return to the present, come into the experience of my present moment existence, is to bring my awareness, my attention into my body and out of my mind.
I'm working on a new work right now, and I actually but I'm quoting something from the Rolling Stones, Ruby Tuesday. Yesterday doesn't matter if it's gone.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, it really gets right at the heart of it. I'd like to tear apart something from your work, which I thought was really interesting. And you talk about the body, as you just mentioned. What happens? I think this is really interesting because it connects so much of the spiritual with the science. What happens to the body during strenuous workouts, and how that it almost looks the same as one gets to, as you describe, the cognitive, that relaxed state that one gets to, as some of the great teachers can get to in meditation. Why don't you speak to that? My experience with this, and I'm just a babe in the woods, but years back, I started yoga practice for the first time. And that was my first experience, not as harsh of a story as you describe in the book with the Arctic weather, but still getting into a yoga practice for the first time, and 3 or 4 months into it, having that first moment of feeling of like, wow, this strenuous exercise just finally stopped my mind from working, from thinking, from whatever it was doing, and just left it empty. And forever now, at least the last 5 years, I don't know if I chased that feeling, but I must have that feeling as much as I can, or I want to have it as much as I can. Why don't you speak to the story in your work and talk about this notion of strenuous exercise getting people to perhaps a similar state? You also mentioned, though, that this is more than just a 1-hour yoga practice.
Yeah, I love what you've just been saying there, Michael, because that's a perfect example, the yoga that you mentioned, really getting into that. When people go running for, especially over, quite a long distance, they can get into this zone. In fact, any sport, really, that is one that engages the body, if you do it full-heartedly, wholeheartedly enough, you can get into what we call a zone where everything is just moving, and it's blissful almost. Even if it's painful, there's a certain connection or feeling of bliss there. The example I mentioned was a very extreme one. Ben Saunders, who is a great Antarctic explorer, set out on his own to cover the journey that Scott made, Captain Scott, very early in the 20th century, across Antarctica. And this was a journey he was taking alone, that Ben Saunders was taking alone, without any aid, without any added support, and with no backup. So huge risk, really, he was taking. At some point in that journey, his head was bent into the wind, great headwind, and of course it was sub-zero temperatures, absolutely freezing. So his whole body was feeling racked, really, both with pain and tension, but also anxiety. In one moment, there was just this moment when suddenly he let it all go. He let the struggle against the wind, the struggle against the sub-zero temperatures. He let that struggle go, not as a decision, it just happened. And suddenly, he was in the same condition, walking into the headwind in the same way, feeling the same temperatures, but he said, I just felt this surrender to what I was faced with, and somehow in that surrender, everything felt completely all right. And I just started smiling, and I knew and felt that everything was all right and would be. And so the tension fell out of his body. The neuroscience on that is really similar, in a lesser degree, whether you're doing yoga or playing tennis or running long distance. With physical stress carried out over a period of time, the body, wants to find areas of activity where it can reduce energy supply. Something that takes a great deal of energy is the frontal cortex. That part of us which is struggling, that part of us which is making decisions, wondering about the future, concerned about the past, that is the frontal cortex. Very useful, but only in its right place. When you're struggling in the Antarctic, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to have the mind racing along. And so the body, in its wisdom, shuts down the frontal cortex. And that's what also happens for the long-distance runner. The frontal cortex is minimized in its energy. When that happens, yes, there is a similar feeling for the long-distance runner or Ben Saunders in the Antarctic as what is spoken of so often in the Tao and the Tao Te Ching, or comparable texts, where there is simply a flow and a sense of union or unity with all life. And there's an ease and lack of thinking, a spaciousness, which is profoundly pleasurable, which, again, if anyone who is listening here is a meditator, they will also know that when you drop down below thought, that is when the frontal cortex minimizes its energy or almost closes down, there is this deep, deep feeling of peace, stillness, and silence. And then, indeed, that can happen through strenuous physical activity.
What I love about that story as well is you talk about the surrender, the non-resistance itself is a wonderful feeling.
Yes, it's really, of course, the basis of Aikido, which I have not practiced, and so I can't speak much to, but I do know that, that process of non-resistance is fundamental to the art of Aikido.
I had a little story the other day. Somebody was approaching me, claiming that there was some kind of a business deal that didn't exist, and that I owed some money. And I said, okay, well, I'll give you a little money for your time or whatever. But anyways, he didn't like that, and he kept coming back with emails that got progressively more animated and angry and accusatory. And I was reading your work the other day with the keto example. I was thinking to myself, and I ended up doing it. I just stopped resisting. And once I stopped responding, then he had nothing more to punch at. It was a great example in looking at your work the other day.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yes, thank you for that, Michael. And that kind of back and forth goes on not only with other people, but it goes on in our own head, doesn't it? By the same token, in the same way that you've just described, got these two voices in our head very often, one saying yes and the other saying no. But if we could just sort of open a back door at the back of our head and just let one of those characters slip out, there'd be no more argument.
Yeah. Hey, speaking of that, I think you've got there's so many. Look, I could go through your work and just pull line and we could discuss each line. I just love some of the wisdom from the Eastern traditions and whatnot. The fantasy of control, it's really the heart of Western culture. And I see this today with, the great thing in America right now, the great debate is the great political debate. And as you point out, there's going to be a debate today, and it's going to be an end of the world debate today. And there'll be another one a year from now, and another one, and another one, and another one. We really can't alter these things. We can't change these things. And taking so much worry into our human skulls is just not healthy.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I remind myself of that, Michael, when I, open the New York Times and look at all the latest
stuff,
the latest comedy of errors that is called the American political system.
Even you, with the training and the study that you've gone through, you still have to look at it all and reach back to all that wisdom and training and say, okay, hold on, let's let go of this.
Absolutely. Absolutely, yes, every time, because this is a constant process, isn't it, of remembering, forgetting, and the more that we gradually accustom ourselves and acclimatize ourselves to that remembering that deeper, quieter river in our life that is our true life, the more we remember that, the more it becomes the major part of our life. But we're all of us in some form or another in that process of remembering and forgetting. And of course we get stirred. Of course I get stirred by things in the world that are distressing, and that's, I think that's completely natural. But at the same time, I think it's really important to know that this has always been the case and always will be. That is, there will always be danger and difficulty and light and dark and good and bad, because these forces, these polarities really are a part of the way in which the world works. And I don't think it's ever going to be otherwise. Just how we respond to that, however, is what is in our control in some way.
That dovetails nicely with where I wanted to shift you into, which I wanted to shift you into a little bit of love. And I want to read something really quickly from your work. Yet love between two people is indeed a great work, and that work is often not easy. It's not easy under any circumstance to stay awake to our self-deceptions and unconscious expectations, even less so when it involves someone else who is bound to have misperceptions of his or her own. Boy, that really, I mean, if we could get that one straight, relationships just become a lot easier, don't they?
Yes, and as we all know, that too is a work in progress, isn't it? And it's a work in progress forever. I mean, that is really, I think, relationship, the real deep refinement process that is possible for us by rubbing up against each other as we do, as well as all the ease and beauty and love of a relationship. There is always inevitably going to be the rough edge in one form or another, because we have rough edges, because we're not perfect. I'm not perfect, you're not perfect, none of us are. And the thing is, that's okay. If or when we're willing to become aware of those imperfections and acknowledge them and accept them. And even then, there's this, I love these two lines by the poet Antonio Machado, who said, the golden bees are making white combs and sweet honey from all my old failures. And there's something so warming about that, don't you think? That he's saying that, even our imperfections or difficulties or failures actually all contribute in some alchemical way to the mosaic of who we are in our wholeness or entirety. And if we take any one of those experiences that we may have considered to be failures or bad out of the mosaic, we wouldn't be the person we are. I think that just accepting that not only about ourselves or with ourselves, but in a relationship, of course, seeing and accepting that in the other is really part of the work, part of the humility, actually, the process of humility, acknowledging both one's own imperfections and those of the other together.
If there's no failure, how do we learn?
There is failure, but it's not that it's wrong. Mm. There are things that go wrong. There are things that happen that we actually don't want to happen, but you may notice that sometimes, in fact, quite often, what seems to be a failure a year later seems to be a gift. We would never have thought that or known that at the time. But really, we never really know what the consequences of something can be, do we? Until, the classic thing in a relationship, of course, is, if you have a huge breakup with someone, it's just devastating. And it is devastating. But then in 5 years' time, you realize how actually important that was for both of you in your own way. And you look at your lives then 5 years later, and you realize what you have now you could never have had before. We could say the same with a profession or job. Maybe you get the sack. And it seems like a devastation. And it is at the time. And yet it can, not necessarily, but it can lead to something else one may never have thought of. Not only externally in terms of, another or better job, but internally. Because something about failure, I think that's really useful and valuable, Michael, is that it humbles us. It actually softens us. It really softens the heart, actually. It allows us, it makes us more permeable to the vulnerabilities of being a human being in this world. And when we become more permeable to that vulnerability, we're more forgiving of those vulnerabilities than others.
I start to use the word permeability. I start to think about malleability and flexibility too. I start to think about just the ways that when one goes through failure, all the different ways that it strengthens you, as much as some people think of fail as a pejorative. I think of fail as a way for me to get ahead, to take the next step, to grow, to learn, to improve.
Absolutely. It is, yes. It doesn't mean that we're defective. It means that we've got more to learn, which is very different.
I brought something up a moment ago, and I kind of took you off on a tangent, but I was thinking about the fantasy of control, and as you mentioned, what you see is often the heart of Western culture. As I mentioned to you off air, I'm in a Buddhist country today, 95% Buddhist. I've spent off and on the last 3 or 4 years in Southeast Asia. I don't know exactly, and I haven't thought about this too in depth, but there is definitely something that when you're in a culture that is perhaps a Buddhist culture, and as a Western guy spending most of my life in the States, there's something that draws me to the feeling that I get overall from the people. I mean, like I said, I've not done any kind of extended study and work and whatnot, but there's just something overall in the culture. Would you mind giving, from a big picture perspective, and I could listen to you for hours talk about this, but perhaps contrast for those that have not yet experienced or traveled to a part of the world where I am right now, contrast for the Western person out there that wants to try and better understand why they might want to go to explore perhaps a Buddhist culture for an extended period of time. Give people some perspective on that. I know you've got some.
I will, certainly. I'd like to do that. But I do just want to ask you first, Michael, what is it? What's the feeling there in that Buddhist culture that you feel that does draw you? What is it that draws you?
It's a great question. I feel like there's a directness, there's a peacefulness. I find less anger. I can walk the streets of Saigon and I can see thousands and thousands of people on motorbikes driving. At first blush, from Westerners' perspective, they might look like they're maniacal. But I've never once in almost 4 years seen an example of road rage. I see people that are seemingly working together to try and get to a certain end. Now, on the flip side, I think somebody from the West could say, "Hey, hold on, the cowboy culture in America, the kind of like the Silicon Valley culture of one guy taking a leadership position and moving forward, that might be different than perhaps some Asian cultures, which are more group oriented." But that peacefulness that I see, and I think that lack of rage, that lack of anger, it draws me.
Well, I'm not surprised. Yes, I'm not sure there's only Buddhist cultures that are so different to the West. It's also, for example, in Europe, Southern Europe, it's very different, really, still in the feeling of it to Northern Europe. So when you're around the Mediterranean, or even if you're in an Arab or North African country, again, there's a very different kind of sense where Western culture hasn't fully taken over. One possibility is the emphasis in the West on individuality. Really, in a traditional culture, is not there in the same way. People in Southeast Asia are more family and almost tribally oriented. Now, when I say tribal, I mean, in terms of their area, they're more embedded, if you like, in both the land and the culture itself, rather than feeling more the alienation and isolation of an individual that is so common in the West. The sense of alienation is probably one of the most common and also most painful experiences of being a Westerner. I think in San Francisco now, where I live, there are more people living on their own singly than are living in couples or families. Well, in much of the world, that's inconceivable. Mostly people live, in larger groups. So I think that emphasis on the individual, which has, of course, great value as well, but this is the shadow or flip side of it, that, we can easily feel unmoored, ungrounded both from nature and from our fellow men and women, from the culture at large. Because everyone's priority tends to be themselves. That's really been the credo of the West for the last 150 years. And especially America, it has to be said, really. That's what America was pretty much founded on. The idea of the individual going for and becoming whatever he could be or she could be. So I think that emphasis on the individual is a large part of that, but also, of course, culturally, especially I think in a Buddhist culture, the religious influence is really, the spiritual influence is really very strong. It's just in the way people are with each other, the way in which they relate to each other. There's not the emphasis in a Buddhist culture in the way in which there is in a Christian culture on good and evil. It's less polarized in that way. I do think definitely that the religious or spiritual culture has a part to play in what you're saying.
You just mentioned the individuality, perhaps the Western cultures, America. I've got this great line where you quote Thomas Jefferson in your work, which I think is kind of reflexive. It says, "Remember that no one is better than you, but that you are better than no one." So it speaks to the individuality, but it also kind of brings you back a moment too and says, well, hold on, you are number one, but you're not better than everyone else.
Yeah, I think that's that actually is the first chapter in my book. The first chapter is called Dropping the Struggle to Be Special. That's not the same as dropping the struggle to be an individual or dropping the struggle to individuate. That, of course, is desirable, and that's absolutely an ideal to move towards. But, the need to be special, that is to, in some way, be a cut above everyone else, again, is very much part of certainly American culture, that you in some way shine more than anyone else does. Now, there are individuals, of course, with remarkable gifts. They do have a special gift. But the irony is that usually those people who have a unique or special gift, because they've given their life to it, they see actually that there is far more that they don't know than they do know. For example, the painter Renoir, the great master, impressionist painter, at the very end of his life, he was 86 years old, and a few months before he died, he was still painting with his arthritic hands. He said, "I think I'm just beginning to learn what painting might be about." There's a humility, I think, that can come with really surrendering to a particular gift that one may have. There are special gifts and there are unusual individuals. Each of us, in one way or another, is unique unto ourselves. There is simply no one on this planet like you, Michael. There's simply no one. In that sense, Jefferson, of course, is completely right, that there is no one better than you. But by the same token, everyone else also is unique in their own special way. It's finding our own uniqueness, which doesn't make us more special than anyone else, but finding our own unique joys and gifts is what really we can best contribute to this life and to others, to really fully enable and find those gifts that are really ours to give and to share. That, I think, is what we're here for.
Roger, fantastically said. I appreciate you taking some time today. You are 22 books into your career. Is that the right number?
It's something like that, yes. I can't remember.
The newest work is Dropping the Struggle. If people want to potentially go down that path of letting go, maybe they don't want to face it yet, but if they are ready to face it, I think it's a great read. It gets people into that right frame of mind. Available everywhere now, yes?
Yes, indeed. It's Dropping the Struggle, 7 Ways to Love the Life You Already Have.
Roger, is there a website we can send people to as well?
Yes, there is. And you'll see all my different courses and trips I organize as well as my books. And it's my name. So it's www.rogerhousden.com. That's ROGERHOUSDEN, rogerhousden.com.
Roger, I appreciate you taking the time. Hopefully I can catch you again in the years to come on book number 23 or 24.
I hope so, Michael. It's really been an enjoyable experience speaking with you. So thank you.
I see a time when those awake will understand how to make money in up, down, and surprise markets. Whether new trader or experienced, college student or financial advisor, protecting against a crash or just trying to make a lot of money, trend following offers everyone an answer in uncertain times. To get started immediately, send me an email, michael@covel.com. I will send you the right trend following steps to take along with my free video. But if you want to buy and hold, trust the government and trust Wall Street, this is absolutely not for you.